Good evening, and thank you for joining us. For tonight, we have a story called Beautiful Brown Eyes. This is from African American Folk Tales for Young Readers. This is the first story I've recorded from this book, but we've read several and my children have really enjoyed them, so I'm looking forward to this one. I have not read this story before recording it. Beautiful Brown Eyes. Retold from folklore and inspired by the stories of Len Cabral, this story originally came from the Yoruba-speaking people of West Africa. In Benin, along the Wemwe River, on the Atlantic coast of equatorial Africa, lived a lovely maiden with beautiful brown eyes. She had the most beautiful brown eyes in her village, perhaps the most beautiful brown eyes in all the world. Every young man who happened to see her eyes when she walked through the village was captured by their beauty. Old men with wives admired her eyes and talked of what beautiful children she would have, and how fortunate would be the young man whom she would someday marry. In the season when the girl with the beautiful brown eyes came of marrying age, a great and terrible drought came upon the land. No rain had fallen for months, and when the rainy season came, it was not rainy at all. Only hot wind blew, and the sun beat down on the village without mercy. First, the leaves began to wilt. Then the ground began to dry and crack. Then the crops and forest began to die, and the river Wimway began to go dry. Soon the river was only brown mud, and the mud was far down the slippery bank. There was no clean water to drink, and the people began to be thirsty. When the girl should have been making plans for a wedding, she was instead climbing up and down the banks of the river, filling a jar with muddy water that she dipped carefully in a gourd from the muddy pools where the river had been. Each day she made many trips to the drying riverbed, and the water she carried back saved the lives of many of her family and friends in the village. Other girls were also going for water, but she seemed to find more, because she was very dutiful, and did as her parents had asked her to do. She worked slowly and lovingly, letting the gourd rest in the mud, and fill very slowly with the precious water. At last, however, even she could find no water to drink. One morning, as she stood in the mud of the riverbed, she began to cry, because she could find no water clear enough to take into the jar. One of her tears hit the mud, and up out of the mud came a beautiful fish. He had beautiful brown eyes. "Give me your jar, and I will fill it for you," said the fish. At first she was afraid, but the fish spoke so kindly, and had such beautiful sad eyes, that at last she lowered her jar toward him, wondering how he would take it from her without any hands. The fish did not take the jar, but put his mouth over the mouth of the jar and spewed cool, clear water into the jar until it was full. Then the fish sank back into the mud without a word. When she returned to the village, everyone wanted to know where she had found such clear water, but she did not tell them, for she was afraid they would accuse her of lying if she told them the truth. The following day she returned to the same place, and again the fish appeared out of the mud. "Give me your jar, and I will fill it for you," he said again, and she held the jar down to him. As he filled it with cool, clear water, she looked at his beautiful scales. In the bright sun of equatorial Africa, his scales scattered the sunlight in all directions, in all the colors of the rainbow seen in rainy season. Each day the girl went to the river, and on the 7th day, as the fish filled the jar, he looked up into her eyes. She had grown to like the fish very much. His voice was pleasant, his scales were beautiful, and he was very kind. She bent low and allowed the fish to kiss her. Instead of being cold, as she had feared, the fish was warm and gentle. She embraced the fish, and she became his bride. The girl's family had been very happy to get the clear water, but But like the other villagers, they had wondered where she found it. And on this 7th day her father had sent one of her younger brothers to follow the girl to the riverbed. The brother saw his sister bend down and kiss the fish. He ran back to the village to tell his father. The family was angry that their daughter had married a fish, for this meant that there would be no wedding or exchange of gifts, and the rest of the village would consider the girl an outcast. They might also treat the girl's family as outcasts because they had a fish for an in-law. The next day, the father would not allow the girl to go to the riverbed. Instead, the oldest brother went, carrying the water jar the way a woman would. When the brother stood in the mud with the water jar, the fish came up, thinking the shadow he saw on the mud was the shadow of his wife. The brother took out a sharp knife and killed the fish. The brother brought the fish back and gave it to his father. The father believed that the fish might be an evil spirit, but he saw that it was dead and threw it at the feet of his daughter. She took the fish in her arms and began to cry. She walked out of the hut carrying the body of her husband. No one tried to stop her now that the fish was dead. She walked back to the riverbed and stood in the mud crying. Her tears hit the mud and the river began to fill. As her tears fell, the river rose and flowed past her. As the water rose, the fish in her hands sank below the water. Her white dress billowed up round her in the current. The water rose above her head, and she joined her husband in water and in death. But as she died, she and her white dress turned into a water lily. As a water lily, she had the most beautiful children, thousands of them, who spread along the river and remember her to this day. Beautiful brown eyes. Thank you so much for listening. Good night, everyone.